Welcome back to the Goldmark Gallery. You're joining me today for an impromptu exhibition of some really big monumental pots. There's a real variety, a real mix to the work in this exhibition. We've got, I think, 8 or 9 potters represented here. Work that's incredibly diverse, and you'll see that as we're walking around. But there is a kind of history that ties these larger scale pots together. Big pots, like the work of many of the potters here who make both decorative work and functional work, big pots have kind of had this place in society as both functional and decorative objects. Large vases, not dissimilar to something like this monumental jar by Nic Collins with this fabulous wood ash dribbling all the way around it. It would have been used to store anything from food, wine, even as funerary urns. But it wasn't long before larger pieces like this were shown as simply decorative objects, really showing off the kind of wealth of their owners, the flair of the potters who made them. And we'll see as we go around this show that the ability to pull off pots as big as this meant that they really were something to be shown off. It's not hard to see where the value lies in big pots like these. When you see someone like Svend Bayer, long thought the master of making large pots in this country, when you see him throwing forms like these, size presents all manner of problems, not just of scale, not just of proportions, but once you've actually thrown the piece itself, having to move it around your studio workshop, the space it takes up in the kiln, the ease with which pots like these, particularly when subjected to a wood firing, for example, for prolonged amounts of time, the ease with which these pots can explode, collapse, dunt, they beset the potter with problems. So when they survive, when they come together, it's a real celebration of the potter's technical achievement. There's a really beautiful pair of vases here. I've got this kind of matching effects of the wood ash in his kiln, set I think near 2 fireboxes, a beautiful matching pair. But I also really like these rounded, bulbous forms here. I particularly like these little vestigial lugs, these handles, something that was once functional and has now just become part of the form. I really like the way that they kind of break up this beautiful rounded balloon-like form, but they also give this kind of focus point for the wood ash that's created these beautiful rivulets down the side of the face. They almost look like little cave openings where these waterfalls of ash are falling, or a kind of fountainhead. It's a really beautiful effect, I think. Svend's mastery of larger forms like these, and he's made much bigger pots still, traces right back to his earliest roots as an apprentice, working under Michael Kang-hyo, who was another maker of big pots and allowed him the space to develop his own forms. When Kang-hyo saw Svend throwing these larger vases, he said he was like a force of nature, the only apprentice who really scared him as a master potter himself. And that technical mastery of making larger pots ran right the way through his career. We've got some beautiful pots by Lisa Hammond in this show, a lovely moon jar over my shoulder here. But these larger Subo forms are diving right back into a tradition that goes back thousands of years, back to jars made by Chinese potters to store people's remains as funerary urns, and then later as pots for storing flowers, food, all kinds of things. You really see the benefit of a larger pot as a large canvas, a space for a potter's decoration or the kind of beautiful intricacies of glaze to really play out over a larger surface. This pot's got this wonderful hakame slip, this tan slip that's been poured around it, and you really feel the movement of the brush on this larger belly like this. You really get to see the individual strokes from each of those brush hairs. And then over the top of that, this beautiful pock marking that you get from Lisa's soda glazing, much like you would get from a salt glaze decoration. This kind of beautiful speckled effect, almost like a kind of citrus skin. Together, those two effects really create this beautiful movement variety across the surface of this pot. If we really want to look at a potter making the most of decoration on larger pots, of treating them almost as a canvas, we need to look no further than the terre vernissée of Jean-Nicolas Gèrard, who attacks his pots with slip, with great abandon, with gusto, almost like a painter would attack a kind of abstract canvas. I'm more used to seeing these beautiful platters laid out on a table with food over them, where you get a completely different vantage point. So it's wonderful to see them up here on the wall. And you really get to see how Jean-Nicolas plays with the different textures, the way that light bounces off the surface of these pots. You've got areas where you've got kind of drier slip and sometimes unglazed clay, and then other areas where you've got this kind of glaze over the top, so you get these kind of scattering of light across. And of course, that's to say nothing of the wonderful kind of vigour in these strokes, the way that Jean-Nicolas scratches through the surface of the clay, through the slip, this sgraffito effect, the way that he's attacking with his thumbs with different colours. I love this wonderful kind of leaf-like design. It's like something straight out of Matisse, this fantastic design that's been squared to fit this platter here. The kind of spontaneity required to decorate like Jean-Nicolas, the kind of peace of mind that you need, he traced back to philosophies that he drew from Japanese pottery in particular. And we've got wonderful pots here by Ken Matsuzaki, based in Mashiko. There's a wonderful Yohen vase over my shoulder here. Yohen simply means the effects of the firing. So these are pots where the decoration comes from the prolonged wood firings that Japanese potters like Ken often use. But I really like this dish here. It's got this jugusuri glaze, which is native to Mashiko. And it's normally this kind of slightly pale greyish colour, often with brushwork. It's a glaze that was favoured by his master potter before him, Tatsuzo Shimaoka. And Ken made a real effort to distinguish his pottery from his teachers as he moved on past his apprenticeship. I think this really shows how he established a distinctive voice of his own, one that drew on both contemporary Japanese pottery but also looked right the way back to the Momoyama period, the kind of renaissance of Japanese pottery in the late 16th and 17th centuries. The really fascinating thing about larger pots is that there is a tradition in almost every country, almost every area of the world, of how these big pots are made. Someone like Svend Bayer's mentor, Michael Cardew, looked to Africa, the way that African potters made their large pots, for inspiration. Perhaps no other tradition is better known for making large pots, though, than the ongi tradition in Korea. It's a tradition that really fired Kang-hyo Lee, the Korean potter, when he was a young student. And he actually made the decision as a young man to venture out from his university training into the countryside to learn properly how these large pots were made. They have a history for storing foods, particularly fermented foods, things like kimchi, fermented beans, soy. But the large jars that Kang-hyo admired in museum institutions in Seoul showed that these pots were just as much works of sculpture, extraordinary feats in clay. We've got a very traditional ongi form here in front of me, very traditional moon jar shapes to the side of me too, probably Korea's most famous pottery export. But I'm really drawn to these wonderful mountainscapes that Kang-hyo has created here. Korea is a really mountainous country, very kind of distinctive, extraordinary mountainscape landscapes. And I love the kind of way that these sculptural forms draw on both 3 dimensions and 2. They're looking towards ancient paintings of the Korean landscape to old Chinese painting. This real kind of mix of cultural aspects in Korea. And a really beautiful evocation of the kind of landscape where Kang-hyo learnt about ongi pottery and which still inspires him today. We come now to Clive Bowen, another potter who, like Jean-Nicolas, is working with earthenware, working with slips, and the kind of that watery fluidity that you get in the quality that you get in the slip. Really making the most of that on these larger pots, drawing through it, using it almost like a paint, drawing the fingertips through it. But as you can see, a very different kind of decorative tradition going on here, something that's quite abstract on the surface of it, But looking back to Staffordshire slipware, to slipware of 300-400 years ago in Britain, where there was a very strong tradition of these abstract designs. I particularly like these really tall forms, tall, narrow forms that we've not really seen yet in this show. They really allow Clive to make the most of these sort of quite traditional grass-like forms that we've got on this pot here. But I think my favourite has to be this wonderful lidded jar with these lugs here. It's sgraffito again, as we've seen on Jean-Nicolas pots, but a completely different kind. This wonderful shrimp or prawn-like motif on the face of this pot here. You get this wonderful contrast with the kind of mottled golden colour of this slip over here. I think the slips that Clive uses, these very traditional colours that we expect to see in British slipware, these golden yellows, these kind of custard colours, greens, this rich kind of blackish brown, they're really warm, they're kind of homely, really kind of nourishing quality to them that I think really works well on these larger forms. We come now to our last potter in this pop-up show, and that is Mike Dodd. Mike, who sadly retired from potting last year, had his final exhibition with us in 2024. He said he knew the writing was on the wall because he was struggling to make these larger pots towards the end of his career. I think this would have been one of the last ones produced in 2021. But it really shows how Mike, who was a real glaze expert, a master at using found materials, going out, collecting things like cobalt, river iron from localities where he'd worked and developing them into glazes. Mike really showed us how to unify glaze and the underlying form, how to make the most out of these really beautiful, fluid, often ash-based glazes. We can really see that on this larger pot here, this kind of standard ash glaze here with this olive green colour, and then this nuka that's been applied to the shoulder here, and it's developed this kind of almost chunny effect where it's got this kind of bluish white colour up here at the top. Mike, like Richard Batteran before him, who I know was a great hero for him, really shows us how you can use decoration, how you can use ornamentation, something that's often not particularly popular in the world of art, in the world of pottery, but the idea of prettiness, decoration, ornamentation can be used to embellish the form, to provide variety, to really kind of enrich the tradition you're working in. And Mike was a master at using it to get the most out of his ash glazes. You can see this wonderful kind of rouletting around the rim here, which gives these little pockets for the glaze to deepen into this dark colour. That's particularly evident on this pot behind me, which has this wonderful pattern, this motif that's been made, I think, with rolled pieces of macrame or string applied down the surface of the pot. They almost look like little wheat sheaves, but they give a wonderful kind of variety across the surface, the otherwise quite uniform surface of a tall jar like this. I hope this exhibition has shown how individual potters have tackled big pots in their own idiosyncratic ways, how it really allows them to show off their individuality, how potters have tackled the different technical problems of making large-scale pots, from Kang-hyo's paddled ongi pots to Svend's masterful throwing. I hope it's also shown you that from potters in very diverse locations across the world, there is a rich tradition of unifying the decorative world, the functional worlds in these large-scale pots. They're works that are real labours of love. They require tremendous amounts of effort, blood, sweat and tears from these potters. To see them together is really inspiring. So I hope you've enjoyed this little pop-up exhibition of very big